If you want to support the Missing Witches Project, support each other. Try to remember that every person you meet is grieving a loss. Not only a loss of a death, but a loss of a friend, a loss of an opportunity. Be there for each other. Find someone to hug, or make yourself a soft, safe place to land.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. You must be a witch.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Missing Witches podcast. Risa and I are here with such an exciting and timely guest. We usually, or always, at this time of year, do an episode about death or dying. But this time, we really wanted to focus on grief. I feel like we are all grieving right now. The whole fucking world is grieving right now. And as one of our coven mates said the other night, sometimes you just got to bring in a professional. So we have brought in a professional grief witch to talk to us and soothe us and counsel us during this time. Thank you so much, Mara June, for being here, aka Motherwort and Rose. I want to ask you to introduce yourself and talk about your practice. And if you could include, I read on your website why Motherwort and Rose, but for our listeners who haven't been to your website, I would love for you to tell them why you chose those as well. So tell us about you, tell us about Motherwort and Rose, and welcome so much. Thank you so much for being with us to celebrate and mourn on this Samhain.
Thank you so much, Amy and Risa, for having me. It's such an honor to be here with y'all. And I know back when we scheduled this time, we didn't know what would be going on in the world. And so it just feels, it just feels like a deep honor to get to be here in this moment with y'all, talking about the power of grief and coming together in it. And I love that the coven is here too, some of the coven members, and just like being together in this time feels so potent. So thank you. And yeah, I'm coming to this work with a background in community organizing and the deep love of creating in community. So I'm an educator and facilitator of grief spaces, a caregiver, a writer, death doula, community herbalist, a lover of folklore and tarot and magic and making music and art. And my death care work really centers around creating collective spaces to be with grief together and creating space for us to be in dialogue with one another around our losses and our experiences of grief. And I teach classes and facilitate spaces to learn about plant magic and herbalism and art making and in times of grief and for grief support. And so, yeah, I really come to this work as a griever and also as a community organizer. And for me, two of the biggest supports that I've had in my grief process have been the plants Motherwort and Rose. And so I love to share about the medicine of these two plants in particular. So if we could start with Motherwort is the Latin name is Leonaris cardiaca and means lion-hearted. And they are just this incredible plant hug for our nervous systems and our hearts in times of deep activation. And I love the lion-hearted piece about Motherwort and how Motherwort has also this in their name, in the mother part, they've been used to support caregivers and thinking about all the caregivers on the front lines of our movements, all of us all of us who are doing both caregiving in our interpersonal lives, as well as trying to create spaces of care and nourishment for ourselves in times of grief. I just think Motherwort is such an incredible ally who really, really like asserts also in the lion-hearted piece the dignity of our grief, the need. And I always like think of it in this certain embodied way of like Motherwort is both a plant hug and a chin lift, like, and kind of like shoulders back, your grief is beautiful, it's needed. So I love Motherwort so much, and I would not be here without their medicine holding me through grief and loss in my own life. And Rose is just has continuously like taught me so much about beauty and making beauty in places where it may not even feel possible. And just like the need again to create spaces of softness, to be able to, I know a lot of your work has to do with re-enchantment, to be able to create spaces of enchantment and pleasure, and that these are like also really crucial for being with grief. And for me, Rose really drops me into this more heart-centered place, this like feeling of like it's safe to drop into my feelings, and is just has this real softness that I think is such powerful medicine for our times, at the same time as having thorns. And Motherwort also has these prickly calyxes, these prickly sharp parts too, and so they both have this incredible nourishing softness, as well as this strength and protection that I think is so powerful. So thank you for that question. I love to talk about Motherwort and Rose.
You mentioned the dignity of grief. I love this turn of phrase so much, because we tend to think of like crying, especially, as like an undignified thing. We go on and on all the time about how, tears are your body's natural way of, expressing stress hormones and all that. And we could go on and on and on. But I want to hear you talk for 1 second about this notion of like dignified grief, or the dignity of grief.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I really think about how courageous it is to feel in these times. And needed. It's so needed. And we've been told by these oppressive systems that we live under that like we just got to get back to work. We can't stop and feel what's going on in our own bodies or in our communities, and respond in some meaningful way, or even just slow down enough to feel our own grief and our own personal losses that we may have experienced. And I just think about like Martine Prechtel shares that grief is praise. Grief is how we love our loved ones. We honor our love for our loved ones. Like our hearts break because we have loved so much. And I also think about like Joanna Macy's work around grief and its capacity to really help us evolve and meet the world as it's unfolding around us, to like be able to be capable of response, to be transformed by what's happening. That grief is a huge part of that. And so another thread in my work is that curiosity about grief's capacity to unravel us and unsettle us and reorient us and re-enchant us to the sacredness of the webs of life we live within, and the power of creating spaces for being present with death and grief together, and what that does in a society where so much of the violence for it to continue like demands that we not feel, that we not grieve.
Yeah, can I ask more about that? Because I certainly feel that in me and in my loved ones, like not just the rush to like continue to keep like laboring and to stay in like a surface place and not get sort of sucked into the grief. We're approaching an anniversary of a big loss in our family, and we're all dealing with it differently, you know. But there's definitely this difficulty in how to make it safe to go all the way into that feeling, you know, like, and I think also if you're somebody who isn't super comfortable with maybe going in these big emotional waves, I'm on the wave all the time, crying, laughing hysterically. That sort of is like maybe my energy or my flux. But if you're somebody who doesn't, it can feel even more scary, right? Like, what if I go in there and I can't get back out, or I go in there and I don't know how to be productive again, or I don't know how to honor their life and their joy. I don't want to get stuck in just the loss. I want to honor everything they taught. How do you suggest people open containers for that in ways that feel safe and that let us access the sort of transformation that might be possible, or the enchantment that might be possible there?
That's such a beautiful question. And I want to respond. I also would love to know what y'all think, if you have ideas too. But one of the things that I think is important is like, I guess there's a few threads of this I'll try to talk about. But one, in the community grief spaces that I facilitate, I try to welcome people however their grief is present without a pressure to like come in and fall apart and howl and be like, this is the way to grieve. Like, I think for a lot of people, it's important just to have a space where their grief is welcome, however like close or overwhelming or distant it feels, because then it's like that's meeting people where they're at in a way that also still is like, and this space is for you. And like, to get to talk about like the discomfort of numbness, or like of not being able to lean in, or being afraid to feel, and to get to do that in community with other grievers who have all different kinds of experiences, but then get to like reflect back at each other, that maybe that they resonate, or like how they've worked through that, or just like holding space and being witnessed in it, I feel like can do so much. Like just acknowledging like what's present right now can really open the door to more capacity to be with grief. I think that's one part of it.
Yeah.
What do y'all think?
Yeah, well, I was thinking when you were saying making it okay to name the grief, I also want to say, like, we're grieving now the unsaid thing, right? Like, there's another fucking war, and there's kids who are trapped, and there's racism spiraling out of control, and anti-Semitism, and all the distortions of our language, and the way that gets turned brutally against innocent people. And there's an ongoing war in the Ukraine, and like we're just, there's climate crisis, like that. It's okay that we're overwhelmed and numb. And I just also want to say those things in case it helps somehow.
Thank you. Yeah.
That kind of leads me to one of my questions that I really want to hear what you have to say about, because I don't know, but I think that there's like a difference between personal grief and global grief. And I want to know what you think about like how we grieve differently when a loved one dies, or versus the grief that we feel about like war and genocide. And Risa mentioned climate crisis. And because I guess the grief when someone dies, it's like it's over. But this grief is like, it's never going to be over. So they feel like opposites. And I'm not sure if they even sit in the same space in my body. I don't know how to further articulate a question. So I'll just put a question mark at the end of this sentence.
Totally. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to like echo the acknowledgements of like, we're in a time where we are watching genocide unfold on social media. We're witnessing a ton of and, you know, and have been since before that, like witnessing so much suffering, whether, you know, it's obviously different for those on the front lines of that, but witnessing it as a collective, and again, being in a, you know, a society where there really isn't space for us to collectively grieve, like to just like actually feel what this experience is of bearing witness to suffering in this way. And like, so this question I think is just so important for us to think about in community together. And to be honest, like I don't have a very like specific definition of personal versus collective. I think it also depends on, you know, our positionality. Like I think for many people, the personal losses that they're experiencing and the collective grief are happening at the same time. I mean, for most of us in different ways, but I think like this, you know, like if a person, you know, loses a loved one to police violence, to genocide, to war, to a hurricane, prison, industrial complex, like displaced from their home, like there's so much of that is both personal and collective. And of course, like I think, you know, there is a difference in the, like, if you have, you know, one loved one you've lost versus you're watching hundreds of people get killed. Like that is, you know, that is different. I think it does sit in a different place in our body. And so I do want to really like honor that. And I think like, I also hear you talking about like ongoing loss. Like when the loss is, it's not like, okay, I have a moment to respond and process this one death that's happened. It's like, yeah, we're still in the midst of so many different kinds of unfolding loss, and many of them that feel like completely unnecessary. This isn't just like getting older and passing away. This is, you know, directly driven by oppressive systems. And like, there's, you know, that things don't have to be this way. So, yeah, but I do think that, I think that personal loss, even if it's not directly related to oppressive systems, or like that is obscured in some way, that connection, like I think it still has the power to radicalize us and bring us into a reverence for all life and to relate more deeply with one another. And that like even a personal, like one personal loss of a grandparent who lives to, you know, old age can still help us like compost this idea of the separate self and kind of remind us that we don't do anything truly alone as individuals, that we're part of this like great web, that humans don't do grief alone as a species, that this great web we're a part of is like made up of the living and the dead, our ancestors, future generations. I think that like grief can really bring us into an altered state of reverence, even though it's not like that's the only thing we're experiencing. I think sometimes when I talk about that, folks, you know, it may not be accessible for everyone. Like if you're in the depths of despair, you may not be feeling reverence. But I do also think that like being aware of coming face to face with like the preciousness of life can really just like root that more deeply in our bodies. And I think like with collective loss, looking around right now, just like I'm thinking about if we actually allow ourselves to bear witness to what's happening, that the grief is really overwhelming. And I think about Joanna Macy's work again, like she says, we must learn again together to fall apart. It's an essential part of evolutionary and psychological transformation. Like if we're gonna try to birth other worlds, that grief is actually, especially like collective grief, is a really powerful, has a powerful role to play.
Can you talk more about that tension, I guess, between, so there, I identify both with the like rage, like the anger and the rage and the irritation and the like the coming into more reverence. But there are some losses I've had this year where it doesn't, I'm not more reverent yet. You know what I mean? It hasn't, I haven't, I still just feel feel a little confused and angry, you know. There's something too about feeling this love and connection for people that are really spread out around the world. Like, I guess because of the way that I've done community building on the internet, like I have like beloved friends who I haven't seen in a long time, and then suddenly they die, and I didn't know they were sick, and they're my age or younger, and they have kids my age, and I'm just radicalized, yes, more angry, yes, more at a loss, yes. But how do we deepen a plant relationship or a spirit relationship or a writing relationship to help us cross over when we're stuck in that rage or frustration or confusion? You know, what are the rituals that help maybe transmute that?
Yeah, I think this is such a good question. And I definitely don't have like a, like a standard, like, here's what we can do. I think the one thing that I feel like lucky to bear witness to again and again is the simplicity of just creating spaces to be with other people, other grievers, like just to come together in a society where there's, our communities are so fragmented, and there's just not a lot of, for many of us, community or community spaces. Like, I watched this week some good friends of mine, or last week, organize a vigil, and hundreds of people showed up, and my friends, like, who facilitated this, like, they hadn't done that kind of work before. And it doesn't have to be that scale, right? It can just be with a handful of loved ones. But I think it is like sitting with the discomfort of, like, sometimes there isn't like something to do to transmute, like, or like sometimes it's just being with the discomfort but doing it together. And I actually think humans are really good at this if we're given the opportunity to, like, our bodies are kind of like made for it, like made for just like finding ways to like break into song or like bring nourishment into these really impossible times. And it doesn't, like, again, like, it doesn't have to, like, I think we take turns having that capacity to like bring that nourishment in and like create space for people to fall apart in. Yeah. And I think that it's also just super real. Like, I don't think that we're always going to feel enchanted to the world. I think also grief can do some important like disenchantment work, like kind of breaking the spell of the things that have a hold on us that we don't want. And that's also just really real and like needs space. And I think just sort of jumping back, like, I'm thinking about, I guess, like this idea, or I guess I'm thinking about like collective grief again, and how if we are able to create spaces to drop in and feel that collective grief, that is a really powerful place to root our movements, actually, in like this real, what I see as like fierce love for one another, rather than like, okay, if I don't drop in and I just let myself be driven by urgency and social pressure, like what are my actions from? Like, where is that coming from? Like, that doesn't feel like a deep well to be able to draw from, I guess. And I also think that like creating spaces to be with grief, like we also need to create spaces to be with joy. Like, we don't just need the, grief spaces. I think we need both. We need to also create like spaces to that are like soft places to land in the midst of great loss. Like, I think that often actually is what I've experienced grief spaces to be, is like, let's come together, hug each other, light some candles, share some food, and maybe sing, and like that's actually really soft, and that is really like transformative and connecting, and that maybe when we're able to experience that together is where like the awe can and enchantment could come back in. But again, yeah, I don't think it's always accessible. I think the disenchantment piece is also a really big important part of grief.
Yeah, we do this too, and I love to see it in your work where we sort of put the word alter, ALTER, next to the word altar, ALTAR. And I think that's what sometimes you see something and you want to change it, you want to alter it. And sometimes there's something that just needs to be placed on the high shelf of our altars and just like allowed to be what it is and remarked upon for that. But I want to backtrack a bit because I want to know, like, a lot of the people that I know don't want to talk about death, and they don't want to be seen grieving, and they don't, want us to think that they ever have cried or what, that they're weak, I guess maybe is where all that comes from. So like, what drew you to this line of work that so many people spend their whole lives trying to avoid? Like, was it personal? What brought you to this work?
Thanks so much. So many things I think brought me to this work, but the first thing that popped into my mind today when you asked was my mom, who is so powerful in so many different ways. But one of the things that I feel like she really encouraged growing up was like, I didn't grow up in any kind of like religious community, but my mom encouraged me to like do my own kind of like grief rituals when like an animal we had would die, or to like participate in different like vigils or to make our own. And she also is just someone who like is a deep feeler, like kind of like not by choice, like it's very hard for her. And like seeing her feel her feelings and like grieve growing up, like in ways that like wasn't always comfortable for me. Like death certainly wasn't comfortable for her, but like she's just a feeling person. And like like she would be both, enraged and in deep pain over watching like different parts of the forest get cut down around our house. Like, and just like, even like how normalized that is in, suburbia, like this, but she was feeling it like every time. And so that really was powerful to grow up around, as well as just that encouragement of creating my own altars and experimenting with ritual. But yeah, I think, I also like grew up feeling pretty terrified of death. I had a lot of like Christian friends growing up in their families who would tell me like, our whole family's going to hell, and like just explain all this terrible stuff to me. And I was like, very like, I just took that in and just really believed that. So like, I don't think, like growing up, I would have thought like, oh, I'm going to end up being a death worker. But at the same time, like I had all these experiences of like being encouraged to be present with death and grief in ritual ways from my mom. And then, there were like 3 deaths that happened for me in a row, or like in a series of few years, that felt particularly transformative. And one of them was my grandmother's, and just like getting to be just a small part of her end of life care, like in just like rubbing her feet and like being present with her, like just really opened to me to like, what is this like process? Like this feels so important, so human, like to just be with our loved ones in death and dying. And then my dad died several years later after a 2.5-year battle with colon cancer. And I got to be like a very active part of his end of life care. And we were able to have him at home with hospice. And yeah, that experience just really completely reoriented me in life. Like I was both very unsettled and broken open by his death and also his dying. Like just being with someone you love suffering is so yeah, it's impossible. And also like the feeling of like, and I have to be here. For me, that was my, like, this feels like, again, just a very human thing. Like that this is one of the things we're here to do, like hold each other and living and dying. And so I felt also like simultaneously grounded. It was this really interesting experience of like being totally broken open and at the same time rooted. Like, yes, this is important that we do this for each other. And yeah, I think that, and then, yeah, that just that experience alone really, really slowed me down. Like my grief for my dad really, really slowed me down. And like, I was not the same person. Like, I think so many of us after a big loss, like do not feel like ourselves as we knew ourselves to be. And I was in a PhD program and I was like really like doing a lot of community organizing and of a certain kind. And I had to like pull back because my brain wasn't working in the same way. Like I just was not able to move at the pace that I was used to. And and then my like beloved dog Poppy died, and I just had like these experiences. Then the pandemic hit and I was like, okay, like there's been so much grief, there's been so much death, and like now that I've experienced these really close losses, that like for me, that my experience was one of like feeling cracked open to collective grief in new ways as well, through those personal losses. Yeah. And yeah, it's just been this journey for me of trying to find new ways of being in the world as this person who is and has been profoundly changed by grief. And like for me, it's like I can't be in a space or like doing work if it's not related, like if there's not space for grief at the table, like then it's like I'm cutting off a whole part of my, like huge part of myself. And so I feel really grateful that I've been able to turn towards this work and like move outside of academia and have classes and workshops and spaces. Feel super privileged to be able to do that, and also just like super resourced by it in terms of like getting to be in these spaces with other folks who are looking for and not finding often spaces to be with grief. Like to me is just a huge honor. Yeah, I feel really grateful to be able to be where I am right now.
And how can our listeners create those spaces if they're difficult to find? Like we always say, if you can't find what you're looking for, you have to make it yourself. So yes. how do we do that? Mara, yeah. How do we do that?
Yes. I mean, I think that it can be really simple. Like I think just like reaching out to our networks of loved ones and saying, like I want to create this space. I want to create a collective altar. I want to create some, small ritual, or I want to have a night where we're talking about stories of our beloved dead, or I want to, I just want to come together and have some tea and light some candles and be with what's happening, maybe read some prayers, some spells, some blessings, some, yes, just like that it also gets to be simple. Like even if it's just you and like 3 other people, or like if you're someone who hasn't even had a chance to be with your own grief alone, I'm using air quotes because I think that there are so many ways that we're held by the more than human world, by our ancestors, even in just doing, sitting in front of our altar by ourselves. like just creating a small altar, like to your grief or to those you're grieving, or creating one offering, like making, some sort of gesture towards being in, being present with your grief, like that can be one step in. And so I feel like it gets to be it gets to be simple, and it doesn't mean that it'll be easy, but we get to just like, create in small ways together. And so I guess that's what I would say. It's just like thinking of like one step that you can take to create more space to be with your grief. If you've never gotten to like actually sit and be with it yourself and like create that altar and tend that relationship, then maybe that's where you want to start. But also like, I think there's just so much power in coming together in the uncertainty of even how to do that. Like just being like, I don't know how to do this. Can we come together? Like, I think there's so much power in that. And I think that's a lot of what grief asks us to do, is like, let's be real together in the face of so much uncertainty. Like, let's just come together and find a way to bring nourishment here to this place where we feel really disoriented, really confused, really like, like there's so much that maybe we don't know.
Since this is our Samhain special, I went to your website. Listeners, go immediately. Well, no, wait till the episode is over, then go immediately to the Motherwort and Rose website. I pulled this from something that you wrote about Samhain, and it's amazing. It has that altered state, ALTAR bit in it, which again, I just, I love so much. So I just want to read something that you wrote, and then I would love for you to just like expand. So this is from your website. The festivals of death at this time of year remind us that grief and joy are woven together. These are festivals, after all, where we are invited to pour libations, celebrate the liminal, thresholds, the dead, the thinning of the veil, our undying connections to them. And grief itself is an altered liminal state in which we may experience not just sorrow, but an impossibility of ignoring the sacred and the magic of being alive at all. The unknown extends a hand, asks us to dance. This time of year can be so interesting for those of us in grief. For this time of year, connections with the dead, death, loss, mystery, and liminality are more widely celebrated, or at least acknowledged, and given a place at the table. Can you talk about this weaving of joy and grief, and this time of year specifically?
Thank you so much. Yeah, well, it's really interesting, right? Like that we have this moment of turning towards death that we've, preserved even in this modern world, and there's ways that, yeah, of course it's been, capitalized on, but also just like that this is still a part of like our seasonal celebrations and I think that is really powerful to lean into. Like we already have people sort of turning towards death and grief and ancestors in this way and ritual, which is so powerful. And we already have like, there's so much joy in this time, in this time of year, in those celebrations, which is so powerful. Like seeing people dress up, there's just so many different ways that people are kind of bringing the magical out or sinking into that, even in like more mainstream ways. And I think that's powerful to lean into, and like a way to kind of like pull more people into relationship with death and grief. And like, I think just thinking about the connections between joy and grief, I'm thinking about how joy is not really like an absence of grief, but a capacity to come alive as we fall apart. The ways that we celebrate who and what we love. like the way my dad made jokes on his deathbed. Like there's just like there's this really incredible human spirit that yeah, it's just like life kind of like reasserting itself, or like this capacity for play that is present, and again doesn't always have to feel accessible. But like Carla Bergman and Nick Montgomery talk about in Joyful Militancy, they say joy is the capacity to do and feel more. It's a process of coming alive and coming apart. It's the increase of our capacity to perceive with our senses. And so in this sense, I think joy is actually something we might need grief or falling apart to like really experience the depths of, and that like allowing ourselves to feel our feelings actually can open us to deeper joy too. That like numbing ourselves limits our joy too. Like we may cry harder, but we also may laugh more deeply when it comes. Like the laughter, and like in caring for my dad at the times when we laughed, and I've like seen this in other folks' experiences in caregiving, like they're just so powerful. Like those moments, like the capacity for joy to surface even where it seems least possible. And I think that like also just points to that, like if we create spaces for our joy, that this can also be a way of grief tending. And like so many Black feminist thinkers and Adrienne Maree Brown and pleasure activism and emergent strategy have just like pointed to that importance over and over again, and that capacity. And I think that's what I was trying to point to in that passage a bit. But yeah, I'm not sure if that gets at it. Okay.
Yeah, I got so emotional when you were talking about that. Because it's so true. Like those, I guess I was rushed with like a moment of remembering being in hospice with my husband's mom died last year. So my 4-year-old, my like kid's grandma, you know, her best friend. But there was like, we had the TV on with the fire crackling, you know, on the TV, the fake fire. And May was like lying on the floor putting little glass Christmas lights into those vintage ceramic Christmas trees, you know, those ones. So she was like individually placing them all, and we're hanging up Christmas lights, and Cece was basically unconscious. We knew it was like days or hours, but it glows, you know, it has like a glow. That memory, there was like a joy. And I hope that May has both those, you know, she has the heartbreak, but she has that like, no, we were joyful. Cece was joyful. We were joyful together too. It's Samhain, and it's a conversation about grief. So I'm going to let myself feel that out loud.
Yeah, that's so powerful.
I kind of want to add another emotion and bring a space for it too. I was the caregiver for my father who had dementia. He lived with me for 10 years on his rapid decline. And there was laughter, and there were tears, and there was anger, and there was frustration, and then more laughter, and, you know, grieving the man he was while he was still alive, because that man didn't exist anymore. But when he did die, it was fast and easy. And our family doctor, you know, the first thing she said to me when we spoke was, "It's okay to feel relieved." And it was like she had lifted this great, because I did feel very fucking relieved many, many times. It was so difficult. It was impossibly difficult. And I was very relieved. But I felt like a monster for feeling that relief. And I was so grateful to this medical professional for giving me this, you know, that I've had friends who have lost family members who were difficult people to love. And so I wanted to bring relief to the table. And Mara, if you like, as a we'll take it from a medical professional, my family doctor, but I also want to take it from a grief professional. If you could give us all that permission to feel relieved when things end.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I hear that all the time. I think it's so common, and feeling relieved makes so much sense. And there's nothing monstrous about that. And I think a lot of what I've heard and experienced feels to me like it points to the fact that like so much of our caregiving falls on individuals in our society, rather than like we don't have those networks in place to like fall on to hold us as caregivers to like spread out and share that work. And it is too much. It's too much for one person. And as much as I think like, yes, we are here to do this work of caring for each other and holding each other and living and dying, like we're not meant to do that alone. And so feeling relieved from being put in an impossible situation where you are forced to care for someone alone makes so much sense. It's just really real.
May I ask too, working with death and grief, you're right up against the unknown, right? And so everyone who comes to you maybe has a different cultural assumption about what happens after, a different religion's context that they come in carrying, or atheists, like determined, practical, grounded atheist people who are like, it can be really confronting that we don't know, like people come with all of these different armatures to something that has no answer. It's not something that you can give people an answer to. Don't worry, it's all okay. Heaven, here you go, guaranteed. Like you have to go in and meet people with more unknown. How do you do that? What do you offer people? What can we offer each other in the face of something so enormous when there aren't easy answers anymore, I guess?
Yeah, I think, well, okay, first I want to kind of jump back a second to this idea of like, I mean, there is a whole death care like industry. There's death care workers, there's, grief doulas, and like, and I'm one. And I also want to say, like, I feel like so much of what I do is, yes, like trying to get resources in people's hands and tools and spaces to be together. And like a lot of it is just being real about what I also don't know. And like that there's like one of my teachers, Alua Arthur, talks about like imposter syndrome in death doula work. And she's just like, well, none of y'all have died. So like none of us have died. We can't actually be experts in this, like we are professionals in a sense, but we're also not, like there's no way that I can be an expert in someone else's grief experience. I can only share about mine and like my experience being in community, and I can just listen and try to bring resources in that have been helpful to me and those that I love and know. One of the things I've been thinking and feeling a lot about, which I don't think this answers your question, I think this goes in another direction, but is just like how, again, with this unknown element, often loss brings us into contact with what was like unimaginable. And I also think like grief is similarly also connected to our imagination, and like thinking about just like this, the wisdom of our bodies if we like uncouple creativity from productivity and like having all the answers and like something a disembodied mind can do. I think about like how there's medicine and creativity in the ways that grief can just show up as like embodied refusal of uncertainty, a kind of like stopping everything, and that has a lot of power. And I think like just this is semi-connected to the unknown piece for me, and like being in the unknown together is like, I think it's a creative practice that we make up together as we go along. It's a process of creativity that, like, unlike capitalist expectations of endless productivity or like easy kind of like 1, 2, 3, here's what we do, it's like our creativity together gets to look more like ecosystems. It's like a process that's woven from rest and attunement to our bodies and attunement to each other, and like embracing seasons of decay, like and that grief can make us creative in the ways that ecosystems are creative, and it has to be collectively figured out.
Is this related to your notion of shapeshifting in your work?
I feel like so I've been just sort of coming back to and rooting in this idea of grief as a creative process, as an organic process, as shape-shifting, and they all kind of feel like similar ways or attempts to name the same thread, which is like, grief as an essential part of living and dying, as rot, as this essential and nourishing and life-giving force, as this having an important role to play, grief as a destabilizer and disruptor of that which needs shaking up, as a force of nature that composts, again, what needs composting. And I think like through grief, which often disrupts these kind of like, it's just like coming face to face with the like ever-present nature of our world that is change. Like, I feel like that is what we're doing as grievers. And so I feel like that is inherently pointing to the shape-shifting nature of the world and of us that is always actually present. And like kind of that grief in itself is this veil thinning experience where it's like we realize that the veil has always been thin, like there's these moments where we come into contact with it and it's undeniable. But I think like, through grief, we also become less like these fixed ideas of ourselves, like less like nouns and more like verbs. Like our like ecological processes, like aware of ourselves. We're made up of all of our ancestors and our beloved dead, and the places and relationships that we're grieving. And I think about how like our tears can remind us of the ways that we are fluid, like coming together and coming apart, spilling into the world, being spilled into, and that like spilling is a kind of shape-shifting site of possibility for us.
I have a non sequitur before we turn to the coven, because I really want you to talk about plant magic for grief support, as a zine, but also like as an idea.
Absolutely. Well, I just think it's so important to note like how we are not actually, like, whether we're dropped into our relationship with plants or not, like we are made up of plants. We are in relationship with so many plants, whether or not we actually are, really thinking about it. And like we're already so indebted to the plant realm in so many ways, but that plants have been a huge part of our death care and grief rituals as human beings, that like even plants have been found in some of the oldest graves uncovered, and that we've been adorning our dead, we've been bringing plants into our support of the bereaved, of those grieving, that this whole idea that we are alone in our grief, as a species, is not really something that like holds up historically, like looking at all the different ways that plants have been brought in, whether it's through ceremony or through meals or through libations or through ancestor plates, through bouquets and adorning the bodies of our dead, or carrying a sprig of rosemary to remember our beloved dead, or just like there's all these, depending on the place and time, like just that humans have been working together with plants have been death doulas for humans for a long time. And Yeah, so like one of the plants I've been thinking about a lot right now is chamomile. And I just got to make a pitch for chamomile right now because yeah, they're just such an incredible plant that I think is really kind of taken for granted, and it's like a accessibility, or like, so many people have heard of chamomile, like, all right, well, tell me about a plant I don't know. No, like chamomile is amazing and super underappreciated, and I think has so much to offer moments like this, or whenever we feel dropped into the collective ongoing trauma and grief. And it's not just the herbal actions of chamomile that it like physiologically is relaxing to our nervous systems, helps us digest our food, is like soothing and relaxing to our muscles, can help us release tension, can help us, is also a great ally for our lungs, for those with asthma or who feel like their breath is, breath is really one of our lungs are another seat of grief. And in traditional Chinese medicine, like that's understood, but just like the ways that our nervous systems are connected to our breath, and like the quality of our breath feeling breathless, or feeling, just like that tension in our chest. Chamomile is helpful for that as well. But like, aside from all of those amazing things that chamomile is doing, I think just like the magic of chamomile, who, I also forgot to mention, is really this incredible nourisher of our rest, and like helps us get a deeper rest, and also has been used to like prevent insomnia, or help with insomnia and nightmares, just like this really powerful ally for our dream space and our rest space. Chamomile also just has all of these like incredible magical like history and folklore and practices, and like has been used as a grave plant to help ease the passage of the dead, has been strewn on birthing beds to help ease the passage of those being born. And I think just really asks us to examine our relationships with rest and rupture, with birthing new worlds, with bringing nourishment into times of crisis. And I just feel like in these times when so much can feel overwhelming, chamomile is really this ally for helping us to co-regulate, to remember to breathe, to like ground ourselves in our movements in this deep well of compassion, and to cultivate this like ongoing attunement to ourselves and the world, where those things aren't pitted against each other. Like, I think chamomile helps us not soften the edginess or like the edges, but like meet the edges, like come with gifts, and that is really beautiful. And also just again reminds us that like attunement is always relational, like that we can only, that this whole like idea of self-care and collective care, I think they often get pitted against each other. And my experience with chamomile is it really helps us to remember both ourselves and others, and that those things can't actually be separated, and that we have to nourish both ourselves and others, not nourish ourselves at the expense of others, or show up offering gifts when we ourselves are not been able to create that space for ourselves. That we have to figure out how to do it together. And so chamomile, I feel like, just is carrying this into the world right now for me in big ways. And I'm just want to share and encourage folks, if you can get a hold of some chamomile tea, or even just like sit with some of the messages of this plant, that I think they have a lot to offer this moment.
Thank you so much for bringing something so accessible to the table too. I feel like even people who don't haven't thought as in such a complex and expansive way as you have about it, it's probably in your cupboard or in your mom's cupboard, and it's not expensive. If it's not in your cupboard, you can go and buy it. And I also just want to point out how much I love that when you're talking about plants, you say who and not that. I'm sure that's something that you've like done consciously, and now it's very natural for you. But do you want to talk about this kinship, this allyship of like um using human pronouns to talk about plants?
Yeah, I mean, I think like for me, I don't even remember like the conscious decision, like when that happened. I think just like the more that I've spoken and shared about plants with other people, that's just how it's come out for me. And I also, yeah, I feel like it's just really helpful to have language that can reflect. And I'm not saying everyone has to go do this, but just that for me, it's been really helpful to have language that reflects this understanding of like, that humans aren't the only that plants are beings too, that like we get to be in relationship, and that like bringing in this like personhood of plants, or this more like animist kind of understanding of the world around us is very much alive, that this isn't even new. Like this is something indigenous people have been doing, that our ancestors, I don't know the exact language they were using, but just that like this orientation towards the world is very much like teeming with life, like not just the plants, but the rocks in the river and the ocean, like the land is alive, like it is. And yeah, I just find that to be a really resonant way of speaking about them for me.
I was just rereading Braiding Sweetgrass, and there's a moment in there where Robin Wall Kimmerer is talking about taking a class of students out into the woods and explaining that she's in the midst of relearning her language, and explaining that in that language there is this like animacy, that the maple tree is she, and like talking about it in that way. And a student is like, but isn't that sort of dangerous to anthropomorphize beings that aren't us, like impose our human systems, human ways of thinking? Doesn't that like erase what's sort of unique about them, because we're imposing our humanness on them? And I've been thinking about that so much, that like there's an internal assumption there that like by acknowledging their identity, we're only going to acknowledge the ways that it's like us, instead of be like de-centered a little bit, that maybe how we think of how we are could be changed by being in community with these friends, that we might think about beingness differently instead of just we're imposing our human beingness on everything.
Totally. Yeah. And like I think Sophie Strand has said like I'm more interested in trying and getting it wrong than not trying at all. Like trying to listen to the mountain, or trying to listen to a plant, and being like, yeah, again, with the uncertainty, but also the openness to like actually look at the world around you more, and like be in some kind of dialogue rather than closed off to it at all.
Let's take some questions for consideration again from one of your Samhain pieces. There's so many, and again, listeners, like we'll link this piece in the show notes, because I think that all of these questions are really worth thinking about and exploring. And if you're doing like a personal grief ritual for Samhain, this is a way that you can enter that. Again, they're questions, so they're open for you to be inspired by or enchanted by. I'm gonna pick a couple because I want Merritt to answer. What if this being together in grief is a portal?
Thank you so much for drawing these questions out and sharing. Yeah, I think the ways that we've been speaking about like grief as being in grief together, as shape-shifting, as being open to being changed, I think that is what I'm curious about with this question. Like, where, how are we going to be transformed together by going through this portal of grief, by crossing this threshold together of the unknown, like stepping in together. Another version of this question that I posted on social media was like, what will we become in this belly of grief? Like, and to me, it's not that I have an answer so much as just this curiosity to find out, like, what will happen the more of us that come together in grief, especially right now. Like I really do believe that grief is this trickster, as Bayo Akomolafe talks about, this that has this power to change us and change the world in ways that are not even in our control, not even necessarily something we can plan or orchestrate, but just that it has this role, this potential. And I'm also curious if y'all want to respond to this question. No pressure.
I love any question that begins with what if, and all of these questions that you listed begin with what if, but it makes it so difficult to answer in any kind of like quick or assertive kind of way. Yes. Because what if, it's just like the most expansive way you can begin a question. Like, what if, I mean, I just want to answer your question with another one of your questions. Like, what if the point is to be so completely broken open that we cannot help pouring ourselves into this world? It's just completely reframing like our capitalist brainwashing about like keeping it together and keeping that brave face and keeping that chin up. But what if the whole point is to break open so much that the contents of your very soul are forced to spill out into the ground? Again, I've answered the question with another question, but we could just what if all day. Instead of what ifing all day, I was hoping that you would close us out with a prayer or a spell. I know grief spells are your thing. And if you have one that you want to share with our listeners, we would be so very grateful.
Thank you so much. Yes, I would love to. This is one that I wrote recently for this particular moment of collective grief that we are in. May the gravity of our grief bring us back to each other, ourselves, our bodies, the plants, the land, the water, the animals, our ancestors, and future generations. May the welling in our chests remind us how expansive our capacity is to hold and be held of the deep well of love and nourishment in which there is enough for everyone, for every child. May our breaking break patterns that need breaking and break us open to even deeper capacity for making beauty, love, and magic where it seems least possible, for making honey at the places of rupture inside us and between us. May our grief make us into delicious libations for worlds in which we all belong.
Let's sit in the quiet silence. Thank you so very much. How can our listeners find you, support your work, find Plant Magic for Grief, support the zine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? How can our listeners support you?
You can find me at Motherwort and Rose on Instagram or at motherwortandrose.com. You can sign up for Grief Spells, my newsletter, on my website. You can also find the zine Plant Magic for Grief Support as a free download there. And then there's also another zine that I'm hoping to release soon that's called Grief as Shape-Shifting Spells for Coming Undone. And you'll find that there as well. And there are some classes coming up next year if you're interested in working together in a more ongoing way that are also on the website. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for opening this circle for us to grieve together, and be joyful together and be relieved together, and happy or sad or grieving or whatever kind of Samhain you're having. We wish an expansive openness of whatever emotion you're putting into your Samhain this year. Thank you again, Mara, so very much. And a blessed fucking be.
And blessed fucking be.
Blessed be. You must be a witch.
If you want to support the Missing Witches Project, find out how at missingwitches.com.